afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Implications of the Russian Parliamentary Elections, organized by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger and greener. The Russian Federation held the legislative elections between the 17th and the 19th of September, which defined the composition of the Russian parliament's lower chamber, the State Duma, for the next 5 years. The pro-Putin United Russia Party won the country's parliamentary elections, following a clampdown against Kremlin critics, whereas opposition figures have claimed election fraud. While the pro-Kremlin force got a comfortable majority again with almost 50% of vote, it lost the ground it made in the 2016 elections when it secured 54% of the vote. And today we have a wonderful opportunity to discuss this topic with two distinguished panelists, Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Baroness Neville-Jones, who will discuss the results of the elections, how they have been impacted by the constitutional amendments of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the hard-hit economy, opposition voters in 2020, and the environment. Now I'm delighted to present our panelists. Our key speakers today are Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Baroness Neville-Jones. Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky is a campaigner for democratic change in Russia and founder of Open Russia. In 2001, Mr. Khodorkovsky launched Open Russia with the intention of promoting democracy and human rights within the Russian Federation. Having been one of the earliest supporters of democratic change in the country, he criticized endemic corruption at a televised meeting with President Putin in early 2003. That same year, he was arrested and jailed on charges of tax evasion and fraud, charges which he denied. Mr. Khodorkovsky was sentenced to 14 years in prison, declared a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International, and eventually released in December 2013. One of the leading opposition voices and the founder of the Open Russian movement, Mr. Khodorkovsky advocates for an alternative vision for his country, a strong and just state based on a parliamentary republic model, committed to observing human rights, free and fair elections, and the rule of law, while campaigning for building a strong civil society in Russia. And we are also absolutely delighted to be joined by Baroness Neville-Jones, who is a member of the National Security Strategy Committee at the House of Lords. The Right Honourable Baroness Neville-Jones is a member of the House of Lords, and she has a long career in national security. She is currently a member of the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy in the Houses of Parliament, and she was also Prime Minister David Cameron's National Security Advisor in opposition, becoming Minister for Security and Counter-Terrorism and a member of National Security Council for 2 years from 2010 to 2011. Prior to her parliamentary career, Baroness Neville-Jones worked in foreign affairs, having been a member of the British diplomatic service from 1963 to 1991. The Right Honourable Baroness Neville-Jones is also an advisory council member of the Council on Geostrategy. And before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules and information. Mr. Khodorkovsky will give his speech in Russian, and the translator, Elena Cook, will translate his speech consequently. Then Baroness Neville-Jones will give her speech. Please make sure that you indicate to whom you're addressing your question during the Q&A session, which will take part in the second half of this hour. And please make sure you indicate your name, your affiliation, your role. Thank you so much. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Mr. Khodorkovsky. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Здравствуйте все. On the 17th to the 19th of September, voting took place to elect deputies to the State Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament. As a result, the United Russia representatives were presented with a constitutional majority, although the real support stood at about 10% of the voters, or 30% of those who turned out to vote. At the same time, the Russian Communist Party was also allowed to have some deputies in parliament. This party has long been a Kremlin masterminded project. Its indefatigable leader is on the presidential administration's payroll, and they accumulate leftist protest votes. Another party which was allowed to have some deputies in parliament is the Liberal Democratic Party, yet another Kremlin masterminded project, hoovering up protest votes of citizens who have no clear political views. Another project of the presidential administration, a new one, called Novые люди, New People, has also got several seats. It is supposed to be replacing Yabloko as the formal representative of the liberally minded part of society. And finally, it has been agreed that the so-called Just Russia, another party, would be present in the Duma. That party doesn't, in fact, represent anyone at all, apart from bureaucratic losers. Nevertheless, it allows to keep the local civil servants on their best behavior locally. We, the opposition, refuse to recognize this ballot as an election. And the body which has been appointed as a result of the ballot, a legitimate Russian parliament. And we urge the public in democratic countries to do the same. To begin with, during the preparation for the vote, according to the Golos Electoral Association's calculations, 9 million people, that is 10% of all the electorate, were deprived of their passive voting rights. For example, the only representative of my opposition group who was allowed to take part in the voting, Mr. Andrei Pivovarov, was only allowed to participate from a prison cell. Secondly, during the preparation for the elections, many political activists were either imprisoned or kicked out of the country, including the aforementioned Open Russia Executive Director Andrei Pivovarov, the world famous now Alexei Navalny, and of course another well-known figure, Dmitry Gudkov. Publications of opposition, publications and journalists were designated foreign agents and either closed down or restricted in what they could publish. This witch hunt, and because of the link to those publications, 3 charitable organizations in the UK that paid out scholarships to Russian students have been closed down as well. Observers, both Russian and international, were massively restricted in their ability to observe and analyze the results of the voting. They also used a total illegitimate electronic voting system, which in fact flipped the results at polling stations in Moscow. In fact, this happened as a result of an unprecedentedly cynical agreement between the chairman of the Central Electoral Commission and President Putin. And of course, not to mention the usual for Russian voting, coercion of government employees and military, 100% voting for the regime in special territories like Chechnya and others. There is also consensus among observers that the number of fake votes for the government stood at about 16 million, or about 30% of all those who voted. The total amount of rigged votes, in fact, exceeds 50% of those who voted. Party lists and eligible candidates, including those from the so-called mainstream opposition or the systemic opposition, had been pre-approved by the presidential administration. Those not pre-approved were not permitted to stand. Candidates for parliament seats were agreed separately, those who did get into parliament, and the results of those who hadn't been approved had been totally distorted. To call this political procedure elections, the procedure that has no relation to the possibility of power transfer, and to recognize the body appointed as a result as a legitimate parliament would be completely unacceptable. No political analysts think that the repressions are going to reduce at least by 2024, when the handover of power is supposed to take place. This handover is being underpinned by totally illegitimate changes and amendments to the constitution that were adopted during the falsified procedures, rigged procedures. The opposition activities in the forthcoming years is going to be aimed at defending political and economic rights of our citizens, at explaining the illegitimate nature of authorities, and creating a democratic alternative to the authoritarian regime. So we are counting on the support of Western public, Western societies, in both non-recognizing the results of the rigged elections, in demanding the release of political prisoners, and in restricting the possibilities for the crooks and thieves around Putin to use their stolen money in order to corruptly undermine Western democracies and bribe Western politicians and provide a nice, cushy future for themselves and their families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khodorkovsky and Elena. And now I would like to ask Baroness Neville-Jones to give her speech. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Khodorkovsky has given us a very detailed, but also worrying picture of what is happening, what has happened in these elections. I have to say, sadly, I don't think it's a surprise. It is in line with what we have come to expect from a government and a country led by Mr. Putin. And the direction of activity is all in one way, which is increased repression of legitimate opposition, repression of a variety in of speech and of political action in the country, and increasingly authoritarian in character, something that I think he describes as sovereign democracy. Well, there's very little democracy about it. So I think that one of the worrying features that one concludes from this is that with the reduction in free media and legitimate political activity, the Russian people are increasingly cut off from discourse about contact with the outside world, and the gap between us is widening. And it resembles, more and more the sort of situation that we were faced with when the Soviet Union was in existence. He made three important points: not that we should not recognize the legitimacy of these elections, and certainly I think that is an important request, and one that parliaments should certainly take seriously, that we should be calling for the release of political prisoners, and that we should be making life much more difficult than has been the case hitherto for those who seek to launder their money and generally profit from their activities in Russia by their activities in the West. I think that governments in the West have begun to realize that this is something that we need to do, though there is still a long way to go. I thought one of the things that I would do, against the background of what is just said about what's happening inside the country, is take a look at some of the things that the regime has been engaged in the outside world. And I want to focus particularly not so much on the military buildup that's taken place, so this is very considerable, or indeed the relationship that's been formed with China, both of which take significant anti-Western form, but really to look at the way in which new technology is being used, because the kind of undermining of democratic principles that has been taking place in Russia is also a feature of Russian policy towards her neighbors, both countries like Ukraine, which I think the regime considers, the government considers, is still really Russian territory, but also the neighbors in the European Union. And there are a number of ways in which this is done. It's come to be known, I think, as grey zone activity. Grey zone meaning that this is a form of attack which is below the level of kinetic warfare, but nevertheless designed to reduce the capability of neighbors and increasingly people who are seen as opponents of Russia. So what kind of activities are these? Well, clearly cyber attacks are one of them. And there have been many people are aware of them. One of the most notable, I suppose, was NotPetya, which was targeted at Ukraine, which brought down the large part of the Ukrainian government, its hospitals, its power companies, its banks, and also affected a large number of conglomerates and commercial activity. For instance, the shipping company Maersk. One of the questions you can ask is, was that intended or was it an unintended side effect? But what we now have, is increasingly a situation in which governments have to protect, both themselves and indeed their economic activity against this kind of attack and interference, designed quite deliberately to cause economic damage, but also to undermine the functioning of political institutions. I think that propaganda, misinformation, disinformation is a familiar and old part of East-West relations during the communist period, and we see some of that coming back, but using this time technology rather than simply just broadcasting, though broadcasting is also used. Media stories are picked up and facts are twisted or exaggerated, ideas are pushed to extremes, and one of the features that we now see is AI, artificial intelligence, also being used for the purposes of creating entirely false stories. Now, all of these things, affect political activity in the Western world. One sees political relationships and financing, as well as close relationship between, say, Russia and the Front National in France. There's a great deal of activity that takes place in Central and Eastern Europe, very often designed to boost anti-NATO sentiment. And of course, there has been interference in election activity. Well, one of the most notable, obviously, was in the United States. I think that genuinely democratic countries find this extremely difficult to deal with. We don't wish to retaliate in kind. And so we have, I think, and this is where we have a real challenge. We have to find ways of actually defending ourselves against this kind of activity without actually resorting to extensive retaliation if we can avoid it. And I think that their governments and political parties and indeed the private sector have to work together. And we may want to discuss that in more detail, perhaps in question and answer. But I think that Russian policy, I would say, poses a clear and an extended challenge to the functioning of democracy in the West, as well as to the development and the survival of democracy in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Neville-Jones. I would like to remind everyone that you can ask your question in the Q&A box. So please just do make sure that you indicate your name, role, and affiliation. And I would like to start the Q&A session with a couple of questions from myself. So the first one would be about the opposition movements in Russia. And well, as we know, last year, Putin's oldest ally and president of neighboring Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, was nearly toppled. Thousands marched in the capital city, and of course, the response was very aggressive from the regime. The Kremlin has always purged the opposition, but have there been any changes since the last year as a response to the events in the neighboring country? Mr. Khodorkovsky.
Всякое сомнение.
There is no doubt
Кремль был
that the Kremlin
теми событиями, которые
has been
произошли.
shaken up by the events in Belarus.
Возникло понимание, что
There was an understanding
даже в такой очень жестко контролируемой
that even in such a
автократии, как Беларусь,
control situation, autocracy as Belarus,
способны на активные действия.
certain active actions could be taken by them. The regime could take active actions.
И с этой точки зрения Белоруссия послужила
And from that point of view, Belarus
определенной моделью для Кремля
served as a model
и тем,
for the Kremlin.
что он решил предотвратить вот всеми теми действиями, о которых я рассказывал.
He decided to prevent the continuation or the repetition of that model by acting the way I've already described.
Thank you. And Baroness Neville-Jones, keeping in mind the recent results, how do you think the aims of the foreign policy of the United Kingdom might change from the Russian side? Thank you.
Sorry, I missed part of the middle of that, I'm afraid.
Keeping in mind the most recent election results, do you think there will be a change in the direction of the foreign policy of Russia towards the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Well, it would be good to think so, but I have real doubts that there'll be any change in direction. It seems to me, if anything, the policies that are being pursued will increase in their extent and general direction. I don't see any facets on the domestic scene in Russia which would cause the Kremlin to see any need to change the way they're going in the outside world. I mean, I think that Putin's decided, that the West is not a friend, and what he can't actively defeat, he will damage. And it's a process of seeking to undermine our way of doing things, which is something which is within his, well, it's within his power to attempt. I don't think that Russia is seeking to have an overt conflict with Western countries, and certainly not with NATO, for all that the exercises that take place are quite intimidatory in character. I don't think that overt conflict is something that the Kremlin really wishes to risk. But I do think they will seek to use military power to intimidate. That's certainly happening in Ukraine, and is also having political effect. So I think it's very much more using the instruments of power for political purposes rather than for outright conflict, but in ways which are calculated to undermine and to reduce the capacity of neighbors to operate. And the processes and the ambitions are all negative. They're also very opportunistic. I mean, the move into Syria was an opportunistic one. The West, opened up a vacuum, which Russia, extremely, I think, would say, cleverly, moved into, and it's made Russia a player in the Middle East again. But is it a player for constructive purposes or for creating more difficulty and more confusion? So I think the answer to your question is no. I don't see any reason why there should be improvement.
Thank you.
They change for the better.
Thank you, Baroness Neville-Jones. There's a question from the audience, and Richard is asking, I would be interested to hear what efforts the Russian regime has made against Mr. Khodorkovsky and his organization, Open Russia. Could I please just remind everyone to indicate your name and surname and affiliation? Thank you so much.
Our organization was designated undesirable, which means that any linkage or association with our organization threatens criminal prosecution. One of our activists, Ms. Anastasia Shevchenko, spent over 2 years under house arrest. Our executive director of Open Russia, Mr. Pivovarov, at the moment is at the pretrial detention center, imprisoned. As a result, in order to secure our participants, members of our organization, they declared a dissolution of the Open Russia in Russia. Similar actions were taken in relation to Alexei Navalny's organization and network of organizations. They were designated an extremist organization, although it is absolutely clear that neither our organization nor Alexei's organizations ever called for any violent actions. And definitely we're not involved in any violent actions or activities. Such accusations, in fact, were not even put forward. Nevertheless, it didn't prevent the authorities of the regime from banning the organizations.
Thank you very much. Another question is from James, and the question is, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation gained 15 seats in this election. What does this say about the Russian people's political sentiment? Mr. Khodorkovsky and then Baroness Neville-Jones. Thank you.
Well, what it tells us is that the Kremlin thinks it's important or necessary for any left-wing leaning people, voters, thought that they're represented in the Russian parliament. This is, of course, not the case. First and foremost, because the organization which calls itself the Communist Party of Russia is a Kremlin masterminded project. And its leader is, in fact, kept on the payroll of the Kremlin. Secondly, because had we had fair elections, the left-leaning voters would have gained a total of about just under half of the votes, of the seats. Not 10% that have been allowed to have now.
Thank you. Baroness Neville-Jones.
I think, I think it's just been illustrated by Mr. Khodorkovsky. It doesn't tell you anything very much at all about the attitudes of or the intentions of Russian voters. What it does tell you, I think, is that the Kremlin feels it necessary in its arranged parliament that there should be a show of something that isn't the governing party. In other words, sort of tame opposition. This isn't real politics. This is sort of show. This is for show. And it's meaningless in terms of representation of real political sentiment in the country.
Thank you. Another question is, what options are there for defending against Russia's fake information attacks in Western countries? Baroness Neville-Jones, you mentioned that in your speech, so would you like to answer first? Thank you.
So the question being, can you just repeat the beginning?
What options are there for defending against Russia's fake information?
Options for defending against, yes. Yes. I rather invited that question. Let me say, I think, first of all, I think it's difficult and long term, and it has to take place, both with and through government, but also in the private sector and among citizens, because the attack comes at several levels. It obviously comes at the level of seeking to disrupt both the functioning of government services, and indeed government security, and not least obviously military security. All of those things are potentially under attack. Secondly, both as side effect but also directly, there is an attack, and here of course the Chinese are also active against the private sector. And thirdly, we know in the social media that there's a great deal of manipulation of media stories, with facts and ideas being picked up and manipulated and exaggerated, and creating false conflict inside societies. Literally, the arguments that don't exist, haven't existed until such time as the story of electronic interference. So you've got to tackle it, obviously, at several levels. The government has to obviously increase the level of national security, and the recent integrated strategy of government lays quite a lot of emphasis on the work that needs to be done there. Secondly, the outward-facing parts of government security, notably the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Council, which is there to help both the general public but also commerce and industry to strengthen its security. There needs to be increased activity there. The police need to be more involved both in prevention of attack, prevention of crime, because it's also closely related to crime. And indeed, there are criminal syndicates operating with tolerated, if not actually actively helped, in Russia to engage in organized crime abroad, with notable activity and ransomware being demanded. There's all sorts of forms of interference which take place. And finally, obviously, there is the private citizen whose communications need to be secure, and where we need to retain the right to a strong identity, but also to a degree of anonymity in communication. And of course, at the global level, there is a very considerable effort by the Russian government and also China, to break up what is at the moment a single internet system into something which would be more controlled by state authorities. So we have challenge at all levels. I would say that this is one of the big, both national security, but also political viability challenges of our time. Because if we fail to secure ourselves, we will also fail to protect our freedoms. So that's why I focus on this area, because it does seem to me the one where there is least understanding of the threat that we face and the challenge that we face, and where it's not just government to whom you should look for help. It is something that we all need to be engaged in.
Thank you. Mr. Khodorkovsky.
It's difficult for me to comment on how Western governments and Western societies could defend themselves or protect themselves from cyber attacks by the Russian regime. We have faced such attacks on a regular basis. We have learned to identify the culprits, the bots. We both technically and the level of individual personal level, we identify the bots and we delete them from the discussions. We have learned to confront the hacker attacks against our resources. We are engaging with systems of the Google companies and Twitter in order to prevent these attacks in the future. Both companies are much more successful, have been much more successful over the past year, trying to counteract these attacks. And I think this confrontation will continue.
Thank you. Another question
There's one thing I should have added, which Mr. Khodorkovsky just said reminds me of. I think on the whole, Western governments and societies have generally so far refrained from calling out and making clear that they understand where these attacks have come from. And I think the time for that is running out, and we need to be much franker about what we know. You can see why governments can be reluctant to call out, because it can reveal, of course, how they know something as well as the fact of knowing something. So it has to be done with discretion and care. But I think that we need to, just as we are now being much tougher with some of the social media companies about their ability to control their accounts, and that applies also to terrorism. I think we need to be very clear about both our knowledge about, understanding of, and our willingness to counter this kind of interference.
Thank you. A question from Dmitry Tretyakov, the first political secretary of the Ukrainian embassy. He's thanking you for your brilliant speeches, and he has two questions. So the first one is for Mr. Khodorkovsky. I would like to kindly ask Mr. Khodorkovsky about his position on the so-called election in occupied Crimea and also passportization of Donbass. Many people from the occupied territories have been used by the Kremlin very actively.
I've already mentioned the fact that I don't think that this ballot could be called an election. And in the same way, this applies to the voting that took place in Crimea.
Thank you. And also a question to Baroness Neville-Jones. Is the Parliament of the United Kingdom going to present any public reaction on the violation of international law by the Kremlin, which used the occupied territories of Ukraine for getting more fruitful results?
I think I've no doubt that when we're back in session, we will be considering that. So, I mean, I'm not going to anticipate what my colleagues the conclusion we might come to, but it's certainly going to be on the agenda.
Thank you. And another question relates to 2036. So we know that there was a constitutional reform, which now basically allows Mr. Putin to remain in power for many more years to come. So the question relates to the future. What should we expect in the next couple of years and also after President Putin finally leaves his position? Mr. Khodorkovsky.
Really?
Yes, Mr. Khodorkovsky, please.
Khodorkovsky, вам слово. To begin with, this is the only question where we totally agree with the Putin's entourage. Both think that Putin at the very last moment decides that he's the only one. There is no one else who could be such an effective leader of Russia. So he will stand for another term. In fact, he's going to do that because he will fear for his own future, and this is quite a positive spin on him as a person. But not only his own future, but also the future of his supporters, his entourage, his closer circle. But of course, this is not something to delight at. I think that the regime is going to toughen its stance because it's getting older. It'll have a very serious challenge, which was called the double loyalty challenge, because the government apparatus, whose average age continues to be about 40 to 45 years, doesn't really see a 70 or 70-plus-year-old person as a guarantor of their own safety and security. So this state machine will be looking for a replacement, who to put a bet on. As you can understand, in an authoritarian country, such a search for the next leader makes the existence of the incumbent unsafe. So naturally, there is no doubt there's going to be a conflict within the elites themselves. So this is exactly where we have our main task. The fact that this regime is going to fall historically quite soon is absolutely blatantly clear. As distinct from the Soviet regime, this is not an ideological regime, it's a personalist regime. Therefore, it has the lifespan of Putin himself, or perhaps even shorter. The problem is what's going to replace it. Because for a very long time that Putin has been in power, and the very short period of time when we had democratic government in place, have not left in the minds of the majority of Russians another model other than the model of authoritarian rule. So our objective and task, our goal, the opposition's goal, is to offer the Russian society is an alternative, to convince them that the democratic alternative is worth it. And this democratic alternative can work in Russia. And this is a very serious objective. And I devote my whole time to that task.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khodorkovsky. Baroness Neville-Jones.
Well, I'm not sure that's a very powerful statement on Mr. Khodorkovsky's part, and I'm not sure that I really have much to add. I think that the notion that Putin will step down in 2 years' time seems to me to be fanciful, willingly, and that the kind of potential stresses in the system that Mr. Khodorkovsky has outlined, where you have those for whom it's unsafe to leave power, which would certainly be the case for Mr. Putin on the one hand, is faced by an increasing search for a successor to maintain the regime. I mean, I think that there will be a power conflict. Whether it'll come as soon as 2 years' time, I wonder. What I fear is that in the meantime, however, that the governance of Russia will become more repressive, not the reverse, and that the likelihood of there being any kind of breakthrough to a more liberal regime is going to be a consequence of, it seems to me, the kind of fallout there will eventually be in the inability of the present regime to continue, and that's going to be both extraordinarily exciting and I think very dangerous. I want to wish Mr. Khodorkovsky everything that you possibly could to achieve his objective, because it's important not just for Russia, but above all for Russia, but also for the rest of us. We want a friendly neighbor and and a country that shares our values next door to us.
Thank you very much, Baroness Neville-Jones. It is already 2 p.m. and unfortunately our event has come to an end, and I would like to once again thank our panelists, Mr. Khodorkovsky and Baroness Neville-Jones. I would like also to sincerely thank all attendees, and I hope that you enjoyed the event. We have now started our events program, and we will be bringing you many more interesting discussions on geopolitical matters and environmental security issues. You can check our upcoming events on our website, and you can also subscribe to our events on www.geostrategy.org.uk/subscribe. Thank you very much for taking part, and see you next time.